I didn't even know that could happen to lettuce. So I was just like surprised and annoyed.
Oh yeah, lettuces, cilantro bolts really quickly. But the good thing about cilantro is if you have it outdoors, you kind of just let it do its thing, and that area will reseed itself every season. And you don't have to do anything. It'll just continuously, you'll have as much cilantro as you want to eat, depending
Which
on
in my
how
case
much.
is zero cilantro because I hate it.
You fall in the soap category.
Yes, I'm one of those people.
Yeah.
Who my husband says have the gene that makes them complain about eating cilantro, which is true because I think it tastes gross.
Yeah.
No offense to everybody who loves cilantro. You want to give your, well, I'll introduce you. So the man who needs no introduction, and you can explain kind of like how this evening, which is going to be a little bit different from our previous sessions, is going to. So without further ado, this is the one, the only, the infamous, the famous Nate Looney. Nate is an urban farmer who knows all about kind of urban agriculture, vertical farming, hydroponics, aquaponics, and good old soil farming, and led 2 sessions for us, the first being on kind of backyard farming and container gardening, and the second one on hydroponics and aquaponics. And it was for folks who just are interested in gardening and just haven't gotten around to, or are just very intimidated about the idea of starting, and for folks who do actually have established kind of gardens and are like, okay, this is where I am, but this is where I want to be, and these are the kind of concerns that I've been having. And after we had our 2 sessions, I said, you know, we had a lot of questions, just a lot of different kinds of questions. And I said to Nate, like, would you be open to coming here for just a Q&A? So people could just say like, hey, I have a question about blah, blah, blah thing that's happening in my garden, or this thing that I want to do, etc. And that since we're all on like devices, like if you want to take your device and, you know, show Nate whatever is going on in your garden. I know like for us it's kind of dark right now, but if it's like an indoor thing or whatever you'd like to do, you could do that if you'd like. And that way you could ask Nate yourself. And I also have questions people have written me because they're putting children to bed and they're not sure if they're going to make it in time, but they would like to ask, and they will listen later to the answers. So I'll turn over to Nate, who has a few more things to fill in, and then we will start asking questions. And then so when we're open up for the open Q&A section, you can just unmute yourself and you can ask Nate. Ask him yourself. Take it away.
All right. Well, good evening. Thank you, Rabbi Sarah Fort, for the introduction and for inviting me back to share my knowledge with you. So in our first session, we talked about soil-based urban agriculture. So what you could possibly do in your backyard, things that you can do with soil indoors. I gave some tips on how to get started in growing your own food, some of the things to look out for, how to create a budget. And then in our second session, we talked about all of the things that make up the field of controlled environment growing. So that's everything from growing in a greenhouse to growing in your living room, in a tent, anywhere that you're growing where you're controlling the variables of the growth environment is considered a controlled environment. For example, my expertise is in aquaponics and hydroponic growing. So that's primarily applications where you're using water instead of using soil, and you're using a synthetic medium, primarily using grow lights instead of using natural light. So there are a variety of ways to get into agriculture, into hobby gardening. And what I want to do today is sort of open up the floor and give an opportunity to just ask me questions. On a daily basis, I get text messages with pictures of bugs for people trying to identify what it is that's eating their basil, or you know, why the leaves of their plant are a certain shade on a certain part of the leaf. So this is an opportunity to sort of just free ask whatever you'd like related to agriculture. So if you have a setup in your house or in your backyard and you have a certain crop that isn't performing well, or you have questions about how to start growing or how to start growing indoors, it's completely open, and I'm here for you to pick my brain. A little bit of background about me is I started Westside Urban Gardens approximately 5 years ago yesterday was when I created the LLC for the company. And I started by building backyard farms for people and teaching them how to garden doing private gardening lessons before I went on and built my commercial farm. These days, I don't do any commercial farming. I enjoy my sleep, and my body thanks me for not putting it through the amount of work that I was putting it through back then. But what I do now is more education around agriculture, and then I also build custom systems, custom hydroponic and aquaponic systems for individuals, nonprofits, and institutions. So I've got a pretty broad range of knowledge. My one caveat is I am not an expert in monocrop commercial agriculture. So if you really, really want to learn about, multi-thousand acre corn and soy production, I'm really not going to be the expert in that. However, I'm a 5th generation farmer, and my family still has a farm in Louisiana, and that's my cousin's arena. So I will happily, pass you his way so he can give you some of that knowledge. But with that, I'd like to open the floor and give you an opportunity to ask you questions. So before we go to the pre-scheduled questions, I'll let the folks that are here now ask first.
I have a question. Are there any herbs that you would say are particularly easy to grow in Houston, more so than others?
Indoors or outdoors?
Outdoors in pots?
Outdoors in pots, yes. So I believe basil will perform out there. Basil does well with high temperatures and high humidity. So the only thing about basil is it'll start to go to flower pretty quickly, but that doesn't mean that you have to get rid of the plant. As soon as you start to see the flowers come up, just pinch them off, and that'll delay that next cycle of growth where it starts to produce flower and seeds. Something about basil production, once it starts to produce that flower, the flavor profile of the basil plant itself changes. So that's what's really important, to pinch off those flowers as they pop up, and to prune the plant as it's going along. So you end up with, I don't know if you've seen in Trader Joe's, it'll be like 3 or 4 really tall stalks in that little cup. If you cut it down and prune it down, you'll end up with a bush of a basil plant, and you'll have more basil than you'll know what to do with. Like, you'll have pesto coming out of your ears. So I would definitely recommend doing basil. I believe thyme will do okay out there. Just be careful when it comes to watering thyme, because thyme is a more drought tolerant crop. So you'll be at risk of creating a situation where you have root rot. So be really cautious of how much you're watering it. I know out there you tend to get summer showers. So just keep that in mind, that whatever pot you put it in, make sure it has really good drainage at the bottom of it. I believe as well, mint is another good option for out there. I actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I built a garden in Houston, and I just saw an update on that garden, and chamomile does really well out there. Chamomile doesn't necessarily need direct sunlight, so that's a plant that you can sort of figure out where it works best in your yard. Fennel, or not fennel, but dill will also perform out there. Dill is another drought tolerant crop, so once again, be careful or be conscious of watering when it comes to dill. And oregano will also do well.
Thank you.
Sure.
I've got a couple questions for you.
Absolutely.
Okay. So I have rose bushes in my front yard that faces west, so it gets lots and lots of sun.
Mm-hmm.
I have at least one of them, some of the leaves are turning yellow with brown spots on it.
Okay.
What does that mean? I mean, they're still flowering, but a lot of them like get really tall. There's hardly any leaves on them, but then they start to bud and flower.
I would recommend getting a fungicide for that. If you haven't tried that yet, spray that on the leaves and on the plant. I believe Bonide, Bonide, is a company that has an organic version of a fungicide. I mean, it's not an edible plant, so it's not as important for you to have organic products, but still, I always recommend organic solutions. So it sounds like that may be the one thing that'll work. When you apply it to the plant, don't do it in the middle of the day or at the heat of the day, because you'll run the risk of burning up the leaves. So
my dog's coughing. Sorry.
All good. So either apply it, really first thing in the morning, before the sun comes up, and allow it to have the chance to dry with the morning dew, or do it closer to after. No, it's a west-facing plant, so that means it's going to get the brunt of the evening sun. So I would recommend trying to do that in the morning, first thing in the morning, that application. Yeah.
The other question I have is, what type of soil do you recommend for like potted plants? Miracle Grow or something else?
I tend to use, and I think it depends on where you're located, the vendors that are available, but I tend to use Kellogg soil. And Kellogg, they have a variety of organic soils. They have a raised bed mix. They have a in-ground garden soil mix. They also have they also sell additives for the soil, like to boost your soil. So if you already have soil like if you're doing a raised bed, you already have soil in the bed, but you just need to sort of boost up the nutrient content. They have additives for that as well. I generally don't go Miracle Grow. Not because there's anything wrong with Miracle Grow, but I'm a little suspect that it took them so long to get on the organic chain when they've been such an industry leader when it comes to soil, that I just tend to go for soils that their standard has always been organic. Here in California, there are quite a few small mom and pop producers, but your local Lowe's or Home Depot generally has Kellogg soils in them. Okay,
thank you.
Absolutely. Next question.
You just have to unmute yourself. If you have a question, you can just pop on in, but you do have to unmute yourself. Or if you can't figure it out, you can just wave your hands and I'll figure out that you want me to unmute you. Also good. Leora, I see you are here and you're not even living in Houston. Do you have any questions for Nate, who's very familiar with the soil where you live, because you will live in Los Angeles as well?
Hi, everyone. I would ask the question about those plants that I got, that one that did not make it, even though it's a succulent and doesn't need a lot of water. I wonder what happened to, how to care for them. How do you call those plants, Sarah?
I think it was a succulent of some sort. I don't know.
A succulent, yeah. I can bring it over so you can see.
Sure, yeah. That's exactly what this is for.
Show and tell. Exactly. From thousands of miles away. Yeah, that one was the live one. That's the one they replaced it with.
Yeah,
so
this one looks pretty good.
First question is, how much sun does it get in that window?
It's sitting on a west window, but it does not get direct sun. It's mostly direct light.
I would say that might be your first issue, because generally succulents like a lot of direct sun. And it's almost, there's a misconception with succulents that because they don't require a lot of water, they're very easy to grow. Yeah. The problem with succulents is you don't know they're in distress until after they're almost dead sometimes, because they retain water and they're able to sustain themselves, that by the time they start showing signs of like yellowing or turning brown, by that point, sometimes they're beyond recovering. But the way I look at that is, if it's going to die anyways, you might as well give it a little bit of TLC and see if you can bring it back before you toss it away. But my first move with that would be moving it to a sunnier spot.
Sunnier spot, okay.
Yeah.
Will do. I also have a plant. It's a little bush. It's not so little. The name I know it by, it's night blooming jasmine.
Uh-huh.
Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
It blooms at the heat of August, you know, or September when it's really, really hot. And it's beautiful, fragrant, sweet. I'm having, the plant is actually looks pretty healthy. I fertilized it and everything, but the leaves some of them are just dying, and this is the time when they're actually supposed to be growing.
Right.
They're long and yellow and, you know.
Interesting. So the leaves, the ones that are dropping off, they're turning yellow and then falling off, or are they falling off while they're still green?
No, they're turning yellow.
They're turning yellow. When was the last time you fertilized?
Probably 6 months or so.
Okay. And then how often is it watered?
We have it on automatic sprinkler, so I have to say 3 times a week, but you know, on a drip. It's not like watering. It's sitting on a drip.
Okay. Has it always been drip, or was that a recent model?
Always.
Okay. The first thing that I would do, so if the leaves are turning yellow, are they getting dry on the plant, or are they just like wilting and then falling off?
It becomes like a paper thin leaf, you know.
Okay. The first thing that I would do would be to check your drip system and make sure that your irrigation is still operating in that area. It could be a situation like if you put in that drip line, say 3 or 4 years ago, they have a useful life to them. And at some point there could be something there could be a leak in the drip line. If it is affecting your water flow to that area, that could be affecting jasmine. If the leaves are yellowing, is it yellow at the top as well as the bottom? Like, is it kind of uniform, or is it like inside?
All throughout, yeah.
Okay. I would also.
Yesterday, otherwise I would have taken you out there to see it.
It's all good. It's okay. This is actually, it's a nice exercise for me of tapping into like the problem solving of it. So the first thing that I would do is, because this is a plant that has survived and it's thrived in your yard.
Beautiful. Yeah.
And jasmine doesn't just die off. Usually if it is dying off, there's something wrong. So the first thing that I would check would be to make sure that irrigation is still solid. And then once you've cleared out that as a possible issue, I would also add a light fertilizer to it. Like, I wouldn't go heavy with fertilizer because the thing about when you're fertilizing a plant is you can do it incrementally, because you could run the risk if you do too much fertilizer at one time burning the plant. But you can give the plant fertilizer and then wait about 2 weeks and see the color coming back to the plant. Yeah. If it's not enough coming back, then you add more fertilizer. It's a way to prevent killing the plant. The other thing that I would say is if you notice that a significant amount you have a lot of leaves dropping off the plant, it could be some sort of a bacteria or a fungus. And then in that case, it would be the same recommendation of using a fungicide for it. But with jasmine, because the leaves are a little delicate, and once you start getting flowers, you don't really want to put the fungicide on the flowers because it's going to affect how pretty the flowers are. I would use that as a last resort.
Does it need a lot of water? Is that the kind of plant that needs more than 3 times a week? Because, it gets very hot here.
Are you in LA or are you in the Valley?
I'm in Southern California, in the Valley.
So in the summertime, what it could be is that just the duration of the watering. So because with drip systems, depending on the emitters, if it's like the Netafim tubing where that has the emitters like built into it, that sort of tubing emits at I think like maybe 1/2 gallon per hour per emitter or something like that. Oh. So if at that rate, if it's only on for 15 minutes, that plant may not be getting enough water. Oh. If it's the type of emitter that you actually put the individual emitters on, and those could go up to 2 to 4 gallons per hour, then it might not be the same sort of issue. But if your watering system only kicks on, like I said, for 15 minutes, which is about what most people do, I would look at potentially changing that zone to a longer duration.
Longer duration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I thought for some reason that because the leaf get turning, I know that in the house plants, when you overwater, they become yellow.
Mm-hmm.
The plants, the leaves become yellow when you overwater them. It's not the same case with the outdoor jasmine.
No, it can be the same thing, but if they're drying out on the plant, usually when it's overwatering, the leaves will be on the plant, but they just get wilty and then fall off.
Yes.
But if the plant is dry, then the leaves turn dry on the plant and then fall off.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Leora. Anybody else who is joining us live, or I'll switch to pre-asked questions from people who are still putting children to bed.
Let's throw in one of the pre-asked ones to.
All right, I'll throw in
give
pre.
folks
If you
time
have, if anybody thinks of any other questions, feel free to just pop in and ask if the spirit so moves you. Had a question about transplanting plants specifically, and this is verbatim. How do you do it without killing them?
Very carefully. Very
thank you. I'm
carefully.
sure they couldn't have figured that out on their own.
So what I mean by very carefully is you need to pay attention to the root mass of the plant. And I'm trying to think of a way to describe how I handle the root systems of plants when I'm working with a plant. I think, let's see, what would be the best example would be, I want to say, like, if you were trying to pick out individual pomegranate seeds, like, you'd have to be very careful with your fingers versus just like digging in and ripping it apart. Like, then you squish all the pomegranate seeds. So it's the same thing when you're working with the root mass of a plant. That is the most important part of the plant. That's where it takes about most of its nutrients. So there are a few things that you can do to sort of try to ensure success when you're transplanting. The first one being making sure that what you're transplanting into is larger than the plant itself. So for example, if you're doing something like a tree, you want to make sure that the pot is double the size, double or triple the volume that you're currently in to give the plant room to grow before having to transplant again. Something else to do is when it's time to like take it out of the container that it's in, one of the tricks that I use is instead of just like pulling the plant by its stem, I'll take the bottom of the container and just gently squeeze it on all sides to loosen up the soil in it. And then I turn the container on its side and slide the plant out. And that way you're putting as the least amount of stress on the plant as possible, especially if it's a starter. If it's a starter plant, they're super delicate. And once they flop over, it's sometimes hard to get them to come back upright if you damage that main stem. So that's something else to do. The other thing to think about is water. When you transplant a plant, they're going to go through some degree of root shock. And what that means is you'll see signs of distress in the plant itself. Like, for example, if you transplant a tomato plant, it's the heat of the day. After you plant it, the leaves are going to droop. And that's its sign that it's in distress. It doesn't mean the plant's going to die, but a way to mitigate that is to make sure that you water very, very heavily on that first go round when you transplant. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll moisten the soil, like I'll make out my little hole of where I'm putting in the new plant. I'll get that area, I'll wet down that area, then I'll put in the plant and then cover it up, especially if it's a really hot day. And then I'll cover it over and then really drench everything in water again. So I think those are some of the easier tips or some of the things that I always incorporate with transplanting. Something else that's helpful is when you're watering the plant, to try to water around the plant and not just down on the plant. So if you're doing something like a cilantro and you watered on the cilantro itself, the cilantro is just going to flop over. Depending on what time of day it is, that's actually going to cook the plant. And because it's not going to have the opportunity to dust, like shake off the water and come back up right. It's just going to be sitting. And if you can imagine those droplets being like little magnifying glasses on the leaf, it's just going to cook the plant. So that's another thing that you can do to sort of ensure success when it comes to transplanting. Also, you want to make sure that you give enough depth in whatever container that you're putting it in, because what you want to do is give your roots enough room to grow into the container. So try not to transplant into something that's equally as shallow as the plant where it's coming from. You want to give yourself some room. I like to put in a little bit of compost when I'm transplanting a plant. So dig the hole, sprinkle some compost or some whatever fertilizer is best for that type of plant, drop the plant in, cover it over, soil, water. If it's in a grow bed or something like that, I like to use mulch to help with moisture retention. And it helps keep weeds out, and it helps with pest management. So hopefully those will point you in the right direction with your transplant.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Absolutely.
Transplant question. I have a bromeliad in a pot that was really pretty when I bought it. And I saw the flower trying to grow in the center, but it never came totally to fruition. But in the meantime, I've gotten many other plants within the same pot. So it's gotten, I probably have 3 or 4 now. Should I try to separate those out, or what do you suggest?
I'm always a big fan of experimenting. If there's sentimental value to the plant, I would say let it continue to live in, you can maybe move it to a larger container, but let it live as it is. I would be interested in separating maybe one of the pieces out and transplanting that and seeing what happens with it. My thought, I'm not 100% sure, but I think that particular type of plant is something called a monocot. And a monocot is like grass, which means that the whole plant exists within that one stem and grows up into it, versus a dicot, which parses out. So if that's the case, if you've got new plants coming in, those are operating separate from that inner one. And it's almost like if you've ever grown lemongrass. Lemongrass is also a very good example of a monocot. So you can take a lemongrass plant and separate out a few of the stalks, and the rest of it will continue to exist and thrive. So it's worth a try. And with that, I also would say just be very careful. And when you're separating out the roots, try to take your fingers and feel along. And I mean, you can't untie it like a knot. It's just sort of like be very careful as you're separating it out. And that it's worth trying.
And any thought about trying to encourage it to bloom?
I believe that's directly related to lighting, because the plants tend to bloom based on the signals they receive from light. So, for example, if you've got a tomato plant and it's only getting maybe say like 7 hours of direct sunlight, it'll stay in a vegetative state. It won't actually go into producing fruit, because it knows that summertime is when it has a longer day span, and that's when it sends out its blooms and will start to produce. So depending on where, it could just be a location. Like if it's in the house and it's just in an area that gets good natural light but not enough natural light, it could be like a 2-foot difference, and then you have a bloom coming out of it.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
Oh, no, hold
on. Corona with the board, and I'm making tomatoes. I took the seeds from the tomatoes and put it in the carton. Can you see in egg carton?
Yes, yep.
And they're doing pretty nice. It's on the same window, by the way, where the other plant was, but they're doing well. I just wonder when to transfer, and do I transfer straight into the pot where I want the tomatoes to grow, or go to the medium size and then as they get stronger to move them to the bigger one?
Okay, it's good. All very, very good questions, and this is the perfect time to ask those questions, because you're right at that stage where you're just starting to sprout. Your plants have germinated. You've got a nice little stem on there. What the one thing to be cautious of when you're starting plants indoors is if they don't get enough light, they tend to stretch, and that stem will be very thin. And what'll happen is it'll reach a certain point where it'll just flop over. It just won't be able to hold itself up or move nutrients up and down the plant. But there's something that we do when we're germinating plants indoors in preparation for putting them outside, which is called hardening them off. And so what that entails is introducing it to the environment that it's going to live in small amounts. It's very likely that if you took those egg crates outside, put them into direct sunlight right now, those plants are not going to make it. So you can transplant from those cartons directly into something large, into the pots that they're going to go into. But I would say that the next possibly week to 2 weeks, you should start doing a hardening off process. So what that looks like is, when it's not so hot during the day, like maybe in the morning, giving them, putting them somewhere where they're receiving direct sunlight indoors. And then slowly introducing them to being outside, when it's not the heat of the day, giving them a little bit of time outside, then bringing them back inside during the heat of the day. And what that'll do is it'll boost the growth of the plant because now it's getting direct sunlight, but then it'll also protect the plant from pretty much burning up in its earliest stage. And then when you go to transplant the tomato plants, I always recommend planting the stem, plant lower or plant above where the soil line is. So what you end up doing is creating new root mass. And I think I can show you in my grow tent what I'm talking about, because tomato plants, several varieties of plants will do this. If you raise the soil level on the plant, it will just create new roots and more of a root system. And what will end up happening with that is, because you've got more roots, there's more nutrients going into your plant, and then you get a better harvest out of it. Yep.
Okay. I'm really saying my message. Okay. Cool. So another question that I've gotten from Liz, it's the story in a question. Someone said that they want to be able to grow their own food, but that they lack, they just don't know how to do those things, and they have this space to be able to grow outdoors. So they're also interested in growing indoors because summer here is just so incredibly disgusting. Like I said, it was 95 earlier and it felt like 106. Just saying, it's May. Anyway, that's like my commentary. And they set up gardens for having vegetables grow before, but then they, didn't make it because they just don't have the skills. So for someone who really wants to be able to do it and just doesn't have the skills really to be able to do it, but has a desire, baby steps, reasonable, manageable how to do gardening your own food, growing your own food, probably outdoors, but also possibly indoors. What would you recommend as
I would recommend, there's a product called an earth box. And I would recommend starting with just one earth box, because you can have a lot of space and fill that space up with a garden that fits all of that. But if you don't have the skills to really understand what's going on with a single set of plants, you're kind of setting yourself up for failure. The good thing about an earth box is it takes some of the guesswork out of the situation for you. With an earth box, it's got a spout on it that essentially the way the earth box works is the very bottom of it has a mesh grate on it that's for its water reservoir. and it's got a little spout on one side of it for you to water the plants from the bottom. And then when you're setting up the earth box, you add the soil, you add all your nutrients into this box. It's, I believe, 10 inches by like 2 feet or something like that. It's not that big, but it's big enough that you can grow a few different things in the same box. So you can do one box, start up with some tomatoes, throw a cucumber plant in there, and some basil, and maybe 1 or 2 other cut and come again herbs. And it's a good way to like produce food that you can eat regularly and get started growing, and sort of lower the margin of error, because if you forget to water one day or another day, it doesn't matter because it has that reservoir on it. And in addition to that, if you accidentally overwater it, it's got a little a drain pipe on it that's at a certain standpipe. So if once the water reaches up to that level, even if you've overwatered it, it's just going to pour out. And okay, you can see that you've overwatered it, but it still has that reservoir to maintain water. That if I were doing something outdoors, that would be the way to start. If you are looking at doing something indoors, if you're looking at doing a hydroponic system, something that is a low-level hydroponic system, I would look at doing a deep water culture. And check out the video, the pre-recorded video from our controlled environment ag section to learn a little bit more about what goes into deep water culture, because that's another simple type of system. And it's a little bit, it's more forgiving than aquaponics, and that's just a whole other scale of challenge. But if you want to start growing indoors and you don't want to go the hydroponic route, which is totally understandable, but you want to, at least have something indoors. Amazon sells LED lights for vegetative growth, and they can range all the way to really expensive, but they have some pretty moderately priced ones, and that's another option. You can just set up a couple of cut herbs indoors and have that light going over it. You set the light to a timer. Now all you worry about is having to water the plant and eating the food. So those are 2 ways to start. The other thing to think about is not growing too many things at one time to start, because each plant has different characteristics. And if you're just starting out, it's hard to gauge what plant is going to need more nitrogen, what plant is adverse to high levels of nitrogen. So you kind of want to limit how much you're working with. And then you have to factor in that there will be pests. If you're growing good food, it's something that you want to eat, bugs are going to want to eat it too. So you want to pay attention to what you grow and start really, really, really small. There's always another season for you to add on and grow something different. And what's growing at the heat of summer, if you realize that you really don't feel like growing eggplant and tomatoes anymore, come fall, throw some kale in the ground. But start small, give yourself an opportunity to learn the characteristics and learn how to read the plant. Once you figured out how to read plants a little bit better, then you can scale up and build back out to what you had before. I see a question.
Okay. Yeah, I keep remembering things as we go along. Can you talk a little bit about the numbers, the 3 different numbers on fertilizer bags? I know I've noticed that the summer ones have different ones than the winter or springtime. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, so those 3 numbers coincide with NPK. I'm pretty sure you've seen that above the numbers, it'll say
Yes.
NPK. So that's nitrogen, phosphorus, and why am I forgetting the third one? Come on, Nate, it'll come back to me. Anyways, those 3 numbers are for 3 macronutrients, and what the difference in the numbers are correlate to what they're used for. So the first number is nitrogen, and your fruiting crops are going to need a higher level of nitrogen. Some of your crops are going to need a little bit more phosphorus. So if you're doing beans, they generally don't like a lot of nitrogen. but they prefer phosphorus. So, you know, you use those numbers to sort of gauge what you're growing. So yeah, so in the summertime, you may see some that has really high numbers, but that's because that's intended for crops that are going to be fruiting. So that's for your, like I said, your tomatoes, your some citruses will have a higher nitrogen load, but not always. You know, eggplants will also enjoy higher nitrogen. So that's what that number is. If you're doing something like lettuces, they generally don't need nearly as much nitrogen, and so you can do a lower grade fertilizer for that. What I find to be really helpful is when I go into like Lowe's or Home Depot, sometimes they have, you know, fertilizer that's just for fruiting crops, you know, so it'll say vegetable fertilizer, and on the bag you'll see like a tomato and corn or whatever, and then I just, you know, I don't put a whole bunch of guesswork into it. I'm like, great, I know this is going to work for what I need it to be, because I'm putting this in a bed with some, you know, squash and a few other things. So that's the main reason why there's a difference in the numbers. There's some crops that just really don't do well with a lot of nitrogen and need to stay away. For example, onions don't really care for a high dose of nitrogen. So it's important to limit how much nitrogen you're introducing to those plants. Also, your lettuces, like I said before, lettuces, your brassicas, they like nitrogen, but too much nitrogen, and you'll start to see burning around the edges of the leaves. So.
Do you use the same fertilizer for the grass and roses, the same fertilizer as you do for fruits and vegetables?
No,
No.
Nope, it's completely different. When it comes to fertilizing plants, I try to only recommend organic for fertilizing plants versus shrubs, because if you're not eating the rose bush, like, it's not as important.
Yeah,
in my
I'm talking
opinion.
about the numbers, basically.
Sorry, the numbers.
That's okay.
I wouldn't.
You would.
No, I would stick to. I would stick to using fertilizers that are intended for agricultural applications, because fertilizers that are meant for your grass or your shrubs have been engineered specifically for grass. And while it won't burn up the plant, it's not going to be what's best for your.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. All right, got more on the.
I had two different people ask, and I know they didn't give these details, but I think it's important for answering the questions. They live in like houses, so they have yards, so they can grow like in the ground in their yards. And they both said their kids' camp was canceled this summer, as is happening like all over the country, of course. And they're interested in like what would be good, kind of like summer-long growing projects for like, not like just for the kids, like, but they want the kids to be like having something they can do like every day and take care of.
Okay, so give me an age range of what we're working with here.
They're like elementary school, not like little kids. They're like
okay,
middle, older elementary.
Okay, it made me think back to the question about like what can I grow that my toddler isn't gonna.
Right. Yeah. We were also asked that. I have a very rambunctious 3-year-old, and I don't want them to ruin the plant, but I also want them to help me. So how do we?
Right. So it's
that was a little different.
A little bit different. Okay. So if they're an elementary aged child, there are quite a few different things that you can do to sort of create your own outdoor curriculum. Some of the crops that I think are best for kids are ones that grow fast and slow at the same time. So what that means is it's a crop that is going to have a length of life that'll last, you know, most of the summer. But then at the beginning of the plant's life, there's a lot of change that happens. And so it gets the kid engaged in growing the plant. Specifically, pole beans are really good for that. Peas as well. From the time, and with peas or pole beans, you can germinate the seeds yourself and create a whole thing out of the process of learning about germinating the seeds. So one of the things that I mentioned in the first session, I believe it's the first session on soil-based ag, was you can create a grow log. And so with a grow log, what it looks like is you've got this book, or you have them decorate their own book, and every day they either do a drawing or they write or describe what it is that they're seeing happening with the plant. Because every day there will be something different. The first few weeks, it might only be counting that how many leaves there are, and then at one point that just becomes impossible. But then by the time that stage happens, now you can be measuring the plant. Well, yesterday it was X amount of inches tall, and now it's double that size. So in the first few weeks, the students already engaged with the plant. That becomes their plant that they're learning about and they're watching. And then the next stage, once you've started to flower, that's something else. So that's one idea of how to grow or to engage kids. The other thing is getting them engaged with the actual planting process and getting their hands in the soil. So what you could do for that is set aside, say you've got 3 feet by 10 feet of grow space that you plan to make into a backyard garden. Well, you take 2 or 3 feet of that space and do a square foot garden. And what a square foot garden is it's a garden that you measure out 1 square foot, and in each square foot you plant something different. And you can look this up online. There's great examples of square foot gardening. And what they can do then is that becomes their garden. They've got these 9 plots of different things going, and they can learn, and more or less based on your child, what works best for them. But they can be growing different things at the same time and learning about the different growth characteristics of each type of plant. So if you've got a few rows of carrots and radishes going, they're watching and learning about what's happening with radishes, and you can get plenty of radish in 1 square foot. And then in 1 square foot, you could do just 1 brassica, which would be 1 broccoli plant. And then in another one, do just 1 tomato plant. And sort of watch and learn about what's happening with the plant. So there's quite a few things that you can do to get them engaged and involved. And choosing plants that have that will give you a lot of feedback and show you things constantly will be, I think, the most interesting things to grow. I don't recommend doing any sort of like heavy fruiting trees. So, there's not going to be an instant gratification if you do a raspberry bush. It will produce, but it's going to produce after the pandemic is over. Grow it if you want to, but don't use that as your main thing. Same thing with blueberries. It's going to take it a while to get established. It's not going to produce right away. I would recommend thinking about some of the plants that grow in your area. And I believe I mentioned this in the first session about your USDA hardiness zone. And so every zone is different in what you're able to grow. Even if the temperatures are similar, every zone is different, and it takes into account elevation, frost times, things like that. So if you look, if you go to the Farmer's Almanac, which is another resource, you can put in your zip code and figure out what your hardiness zone is, and it will give you a list, or it will show you pretty much a matrix of what you can grow all year based on month. And so you can say, okay, we're going into June. I want to plant in June. Here are all the crops that will grow in my area in June. And then you take that list and you pick which of those you want to incorporate in your growing.
Cool. Good answer. Any other questions for me, Gina or Leora?
I have one more question. I have a fruit tree, an orange fruit tree, which is the Wednesdya kind. And all of a sudden it grew very tall. It has fruit on it, and I wonder if I should trim it now. It's not that hot out, but I wonder if I should wait till the weather cools off, or I can trim it now.
I would lean towards not trimming it now.
Not trimming.
Just because the weather here is so, 1 minute it's nice, the next minute it's 115 degrees.
Yeah.
And you can run the risk of shocking your plant. So I would just wait till it's time
Wait.
to trim it again. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. That's a good question. I mean, it's something that comes up all the time, and I've made that mistake myself, and that's why I can speak to waiting. You know, because I've been in situations where we're like, well, it's been in the 60s for the past 4 days. I can trim it now, and then the next week it's in the 90s. So yeah.
Well, I have one question to ask before we begin, because I might as well. And Jennifer, if you have any questions, feel free to chime in with any of your questions about trying to grow things and not kill them. Are there things that you should not transplant that, like, if they come in a pot, like, you just don't mess with it?
Radishes have a hard time being transplanted. Any sort of rooting vegetables sometimes can be harder to transplant. It's not impossible to transplant, but you have to be very careful during that transplant process, because the whole part that you're eating is the root. So if you damage the root system, then it's out the window. Outside of that, even beets they recommend that you plant them directly, but you can go to the local nursery and buy beet starts and then plant that in the ground. So the only things that I can think of that I really would steer away from trying to transplant is carrots once they've started to establish. It's one thing if it's just like the beginning part of the carrot and it doesn't really have a root system to it yet, but once that carrot develops and you dig it out and try to transplant it into something bigger, good luck with it actually surviving.
Okay. Good to know.
Yep. I mean, just about anything can be transplanted, and you can take things from soil and put them in a hydroponic system, and vice versa. You know, it's just as long as you're very careful with the root system, you can do it either way.
I was going to ask you, what about growing garlic? Like, you know, sometimes I have garlic sitting on my countertop and it starts to sprout green.
Mm-hmm.
What can I do if I want to?
So some garlic that sprouts, sometimes in the U.S., is treated to keep it from regrowing. And when the garlic is treated, it may still sprout, but it won't be successful when you transplant it. I always say try it anyways and see what happens. But often if I'm planning to plant garlic, I'll order seed garlic ahead of time. I always will take the one with the green little bits of it and throw it in the ground just to see what happens, because I've already paid for it. But with garlic, when you're transplanting it, soak it overnight before you put it in the ground. And that's just about the only thing that's would be different from it. And then when you plant it, make sure that you just plant it with that green tip up and above just right above the soil line. And
what about growing it in a pot instead of in the ground? Will that work?
I haven't tried that myself. I can't see why it wouldn't work as long as the pot is big enough. The pot would need to be significantly larger than the garlic bulb itself, because as the bulb spreads out, it's going to put pressure on the pot. It's not going to break the pot, but that pressure is just going to limit how much the garlic actually grows, because it's going to be fighting against the soil.
Okay, I just can't put it in the ground because I've got dogs.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you use something like an earth box or a trough, absolutely that'll work. That will work as well.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely try it. I'm always a fan of trying stuff. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but you might as well try it.
Okay.
There you go. We're very supportive here. You give it a shot. Worst can happen is that it dies.
Yep. And story of my life.
I'm pretty confident that I've killed more plants than all of y'all combined at this point.
I think it's the most important thing, though, is because so many, I've gotten like the majority of questions I've gotten from both people who've done a lot of gardening, people who are like, I'm interested, but I don't know where to start, or like, I don't want to kill it, or I've only killed plants, or oh my God, I've killed so many plants. Like, I don't know, I've killed this, one of these plants already dead. So like, you know, like, we all kill lots of plants, so maybe it's just helpful to hear that someone who like literally this is what they do, is that they like build gardens for other people, that if you've killed lots of plants, we can kill lots of plants too.
It's just a part of the process and a part of the learning experience. Sometimes I kill plants on purpose and just seeing how far I could take them to the edge to be able to bring them back. So when I come across something in a garden, I know whether it is absolutely a loss or it's something that can come back. So totally okay to experiment. That's part of the learning process. And through the trial and error, you'll learn for the next season, okay, I'm not going to do it that way this time. But still try it. It's definitely worth trying. And I invite everybody to grow a little something more.
And on that note, thank you so much to Nate, the good Jewish boy who became a farmer. And we appreciate you taking your time to be with us. Oh, Jennifer. Hi, Jennifer. You're back.
Hey.
I've been here all along.
I know. We didn't see you. We felt your presence, like the Holy Spirit.
I was making notes.
Nice. She really does take notes. We talk about it
I
after.
do, honestly.
Awesome.
I've got Earthbox up on my screen. I'm looking at it right now.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly.
I Googled it as soon as you said it so I wouldn't forget.
It's one of the most forgiving types of grow system, soil-based boxes to grow in. Absolutely.
I love that. I'm definitely going to recommend that to the folks who are like, I want to do this, but I don't want to kill everything, as I always do. I'm like, Earthbox.
Yeah, Earthbox.
Earthbox. Yeah.
Yep.
So thank you so much for your time. As always, you're
Absolutely.
wonderful. Be well. And thank you to all of you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Y'all take it easy and grow something.
Okay.
Good luck.
Yes. Good luck to everybody. Night.